I guess this doesn't need too much of an intro except me saying that this is part 2, but the order doesn't really matter here, so as long as you watch both parts, that's fine. All I need to say is that here I'm reviewing every film nominated in any category at the Oscars, with the exception of short films, documentaries, and the big franchise films that I plan to review later on as part of other videos covering those franchises. With that said, there's still a lot of films to get through, so let's jump in. Oh, also, very briefly, I am kind of poorly, so if you can tell, then I apologise, but if you can't tell, then be impressed because I'm actually suffering tremendously. Killers of the Flower Moon is so boring. I mean, goodness me. First of all, it's way too long, like unreasonably and offensively long. It insults me that this movie takes up 3.5 hours. I complained about how boring this movie was to my wife, and she asked me what it was about. I said it's a 3.5 hour movie about a guy who poisons his wife. She said, yeah, that does sound pretty boring. One of the issues is I don't care about Ernest. He's Leonardo DiCaprio's character. He doesn't have a very strong personality. He's mostly just going along with whatever his uncle says, and his only vague characterization is that he likes money. But to me, this guy left no impression other than just a random dude who does stuff. William Hale, the uncle, was a bit more interesting, but the movie doesn't focus on him much. And then his wife Molly, who's getting poisoned, the main issue is that she kind of just rolls over and accepts her fate until some people check in on her and actually take her to a hospital. There's a sense of inevitability that hangs over this movie, which makes the whole movie depressing in a way that just doesn't inspire any strong emotions from me at all. Like, the Osage Indians aren't even allowed to manage their own finances because of government rules, so what hope do they have of resisting these murders? Most of this film is just people being murdered and nothing really being done about it. Also, in general, I always find it kind of boring how in crime films, a lot of the time the criminals just decide to murder someone and then they pretty effortlessly do it. It happens in mob movies a lot too. Oh no, there's a guy we need to shoot dead. I guess now we'll have to shoot him dead. And then they shoot him dead. When I think about films with a really exciting plot, it usually doesn't feature people mostly just thinking there's a problem, immediately deciding upon a solution, and then effortlessly doing that thing. Obviously, this does mean things get better when the FBI actually get involved and there's a meaningful opposition to the people doing the murders. Shocking, I know. Turns out actually having some pushback against the bad guys makes for a more entertaining movie. But even once the FBI show up, they quite rapidly start charging people, so it then turns into a courtroom drama. The most interesting moment is Ernest struggling with the idea of having to murder Molly, because I guess he liked her, but just wanted to kill her whole family. It's kind of interesting to see a movie about Native Americans suffering where the government aren't actively endorsing it. The bad guys here are petty criminals who eventually get taken down by the feds. So insofar as this is a criticism of American society, it's mostly just criticizing their complacency and the fact that the state just didn't care about helping these people out. But for me, that kind of makes this whole film seem even more pointless. If you summarize it, it's just that a bunch of random petty criminals start to kill members of this tribe. They get away with it because the tribe has no real power to defend themselves, but then, as soon as they face the slightest pushback, all the criminals immediately start ratting each other out, and the FBI solves the issue almost immediately. By the way, yes, obviously this film is competently made and shot. There were no fantastically artistic moments that blew me away, but there's stuff going on to appreciate. But this appears to be a movie that should be about the plot. It focuses a lot on the plot, but the plot is really boring. What would I rate this movie? Well, out of every single movie nominated for any awards, and probably every single movie I've seen this entire past year, this is the one I would least like to watch. If you showed me a list of every film I watched last year, which would be a list of several hundred films, and you said you need to watch all these movies, but there's one you can avoid having to watch again, it would be this film. So you tell me, what should I rate a movie about which that's my overall conclusion? I watched the Twilight movies last year. I'd rather watch all of them again than watch this film. I'm giving it a high 3, purely because it's competent and covers an interesting period of history. Next, there's Capitano. Fun fact, I've actually mentioned this movie on this channel before in a probably very surprising context. It was in my Mr. Bircham review where I said that a conservative could make a very funny parody of this movie, because essentially this movie is about the hot button political issue of illegal immigration, and it does show the reality of how dangerous it is. At almost every stage of this journey, people die. As they drive across the desert, people fall off the trucks and are just left to die. When they start walking across the desert, people are running out of energy and dying. They encounter corrupt officials trying to steal their money, and also straight up organized criminals willing to torture them for money and sell them into slavery, which shouldn't be that surprising because definitionally the people they're trusting to help them along this journey are human traffickers. They're not good people. But by the end of the movie, it kind of has a vaguely triumphant tone, like the implication seems to be that now they've made it to Italy and they can enjoy their new lives in Europe. Sure, they went through all of that hardship, but they reached their reward, a new life in Europe. So the basic parody idea was that human traffickers could literally use this movie as a promotional tool for their criminal enterprise. I think that would be funny. These characters seem very naive in a way that causes an emotionally interesting disconnect, like the plan is to take his injured cousin to Europe so they can take him to the hospital, but hospitals don't just let non-citizens in without ID, they're paid for by taxes, so you need to be a citizen to access them. My wife is an American who immigrated here legally with a spousal visa, and part of that involved paying a fee to cover her access to the National Health Service. When I travel outside of my country, I buy health insurance because I wouldn't be covered in other countries. I will say this, I don't know if this movie necessarily has a message about illegal immigration. It's possible it's just neutrally presenting it as a reality that people experience. Certainly at the beginning it presents a more negative view. Obviously I've mentioned people die, but there's also the fact that his mother actively tells him she'd rather he stayed with her, so he's abandoning his family. And there's a moment where someone specifically tells him Europe isn't some magical place where there are no problems, there is poverty and homelessness in Europe. But as I already said, the ending seems kind of triumphant, so maybe this movie isn't saying something one way or the other. It's definitely a very manufactured movie though. Like, it starts off very dark and dramatic, as I've already said. The lowest point is when they're in the mafia torture camp, but from that point onwards it gets kind of ridiculously whimsical and idealistic. Like, he randomly befriends this guy who happens to be a competent builder, so then when he gets sold as a slave, this guy insists that the main character, Seydu, come along with him, even though he has no such practical skills. Then this guy who has brought them as slaves randomly after seemingly not that much time, decides to not only set them free, but give them money to travel to Tripoli. Just one of those everyday decent slave owners, I guess. Then, when in Tripoli, he's somehow able to track down his cousin, despite the fact his cousin was arrested by border patrol agents, and it turns out that just somehow he managed to escape. He was also shot in the leg, but made it all the way to Tripoli. And then, randomly, this doctor is just willing to give him free medical attention and tell him exactly where to get medical supplies from. Then he realizes he needs to go to a proper hospital in Italy, so he meets up with this gangster who is a human trafficker, but he doesn't have enough money for 2 people to cross. And this guy is like, hey, no problem, you can drive the boat. So conveniently, even though this option of being the captain of the boat means you get to make the crossing for free, no one else has taken up this offer, which you'd assume would be very attractive. If you can actually cross over to Europe for free, I'd assume plenty of desperate people would be offering to do that, but it just so happens that Seydu is the only one made this offer. And even then, he still refuses it and tells the guy to find someone else, even after this gangster goes out of his way to show him how the boat operates. The movie's called The Captain, but he's only the captain for the final 10 minutes or so of the film. And then the ending of the film doesn't give the impression these people are about to be arrested and put in detention for, you know, illegally crossing the border. So maybe whatever pixie dust was strewn across the final half of this film extends to the Italian Coast Guard too, who would just be like, wow, you paid let me do an accent, it'll be funny. Well, you paid human traffickers loads of money to illegally enter our country. Why didn't you say so? Here's your official Italian citizenship. There we go. I just wish this film said something about its subject, or if it wants to present a cold, hard, morally neutral look at the issue, at least imbue it with a sense of realism. Anyway, time for a compliment. This film is really vibrant looking, there are lots of pretty scenes, and I definitely enjoy how this film looks. It's also perfectly well acted, and on a technical level I have no criticisms. It's really just the theme, plot, emotion intersection where this film gets confusing. Not even bad, just confusing. And again, not confusing in an interesting, nuanced way, confusing in that I just don't really get what this film is even doing. In fact, just checking IMDb, when I first saw this film I gave it a 7 out of 10, I'm gonna knock that down to a middling 6, and most of that is just for the visuals. The plot is actually not that impressive in my view, and I can't recognize it as being in service of any real point. Perfect Days really is my type of film. Firstly, I generally love slow-paced movies, films that are entirely content to just allow moments to breathe. I'm also a really huge fan of the entire notion of taking pride in your work. This movie is about a guy who's just a toilet cleaner, and some might say that's not a dignified job, but it's a job that needs doing, and I don't think doing what needs to be done ever comes at a cost to dignity. He also has a very simple lifestyle, living in a small house and deriving enjoyment from his books and his cassette tapes. He lives entirely offline seemingly, and has little interest in excessive wealth. Again, I really like this. The film, through its protagonist, has a fantastic ability to find the beauty and serenity in the simple things. And the final big thing to praise is the soundtrack itself, made up largely of the music that this guy chooses to listen to as he's traveling from location to location. There isn't a consistent character aside from the main guy, called Hirayama by the way. Rather, lots of random characters show up and have small moments. There are people he runs into regularly in his daily routine and silently acknowledges. Then there's his unreliable assistant who eventually quits and leaves him in the lurch. There's also his niece who briefly shows up before being collected by her mother. His niece's appreciation for his lifestyle and his sister's judgmental attitude towards it suggests that maybe his wider family is actually quite well off financially, and the fact his niece ran away to be with him implies she finds less happiness in that more wealthy household. Still, the encounter also leaves Hirayama unhappy, which is where the nuance in interpretation kicks in. His life does start to feel a bit more difficult than previously presented. Just a few things go kind of wrong and he gives into some vices like drinking and smoking. I really just interpret this as basically saying that no life can be perfect, that ultimately a simple life isn't going to be devoid of conflict and complication, but that we should be able to roll with what life throws at us. And indeed, his final interaction of the film is kind of depressing, but he finds happiness in that moment, so it still ends optimistically. I think it might have been nicer if more of the characters contributed something thematically substantive. I mean, I'm sure there's interpretations that could be made of the significance of each character, but a large part of this film is just watching a guy going about his life, which is something I'm down for, but to consider the film a lot better, I'd need to be able to take something else away from it. The fact this is going to be one of my shorter summaries should speak to that issue. I don't expect to be spoon-fed a message by any means, but just given something to chew on, because yeah, this film is great, but at times you are aware it's not that far removed from an aesthetically shot daily routine vlog you could find on YouTube. But insofar as it's something beyond that, it is really good. I'm just aware of other films that affect me on a deeper level than this. Still, this is one of my favourite films of the year, and I'd happily give this one a high 8 out of 10. So, this was my second time watching The Teacher's Lounge, and both times I've really struggled to finish it. Like, I've had to pause the movie and walk around because it's so boring. And that's not the case for most of these other films. Killers of the Flower Moon, sure, but that's because it's so long. This film is, I think, the shortest of all the live-action films I'm reviewing. The reason it's so boring is because it's about an incredibly weak protagonist. Maybe this is just a me problem, but when the main character of a film is just completely unable to rise to the task at hand, I can't help but mentally check out. The context here is that a woman steals from her workplace, which is a school. Another woman, the main character, secretly records her and then brings this to the school's attention. It's really not clear why she does this. Early on, she seems bizarrely unbothered by the stealing. Everyone's talking about it as an issue at the school, and she just seems to think they should ignore it. She's also irritatingly PC about the whole thing. Like, she's very quick to insinuate people are being problematic if they express their suspicions in any kind of controversial way. But either way, once she outs the thief, the rest of the film is her facing hostility from the thief's son, a boy called Oscar. My core evidence regarding her being very weak as a character is that this kid punches her in the face and steals and then destroys her laptop, but for some reason she's like, well, we shouldn't be too hard on him. Why not? When I was at school, no child ever punched a teacher in the face. Even the most violent and intimidating kid in my year, the Nelson Muntz of my school, once squared up to a teacher before stopping and declaring, I hate that I can't hit teachers. So sure, he got in trouble for that, but if a student actually did hit a teacher, that would be an insane breakdown in discipline. So yeah, I just don't really have much respect for this character who's like, well, it was just a little punch in the face, let's not go too hard on him. Also, part of this film doesn't really make much sense. Like, it's not clear if the students as a collective are on Oscar's side or not. At some points the film introduces the idea maybe she's a liar, but she's clearly not. Like, we saw the video of the woman stealing from her, and her subsequent behaviour makes it clear the thief is guilty. Also, she's clearly a terrible mother based on the behaviour of her son. To the extent there's two sides in this conflict, it's that it's bad a video was taken of people without their consent, although considering that allowed them to catch the thief, I don't see how they can can complain too much about that. If I was having items stolen at my workplace, I would have nothing but high fives and gratitude to whoever decided to make a secret film to catch the thief in the act. Overall, I didn't get any sense of thematic or emotional nuance from this. It's just a movie about a teacher who's not very good at disciplining a student. The conclusion is actually the only interesting moment. Early on, she gave Oscar a Rubik's Cube, and then at the end, he hands it back to her and shows it's completed, implying that on some level, she's got through to him. Also, he seems resistant to going back home with his mum, so maybe she was abusive as well as being a thief. This vaguely gestures at the possibility of some interesting nuance, but it's not that impressive. What I am impressed by though is my consistency. I was thinking after my second watch this warrants a middling 4 out of 10, and turns out a 4 is exactly what I rated it on IMDb. It gets some points for being competently made regarding all the technical points of filmmaking, but it's in service of a story I found utterly uninteresting due to the behaviour and attitude of the main characters. El Conde has a really simple premise. What if Augusto Pinochet was a vampire? On the surface this makes sense. Vampires are generally portrayed as aristocratic, as psychopaths happy to kill those beneath them, and as bloodsuckers just like the bourgeoisie. With that said, I think this movie would have been much more interesting if it focused on the Pinochet regime, or perhaps on Operation Condor more generally. Instead, it's set after Pinochet is believed to be dead, and is stuck in hiding with a handful of his relatives. There is some interesting vampire lore in this universe, that vampires can fake human mortality by restricting their intake of blood, and can then rejuvenate themselves back to childhood by consuming lots of human hearts. With this said, I'd also probably find this movie more interesting if it took place after Pinochet had rejuvenated himself and was about a modern day younger count trying to crush the workers under his boot again. I'm not saying this movie is intolerably boring, but it is just about a bunch of people hanging out in a house having conversations. I also feel this movie could have been more satirical and biting. Beyond the basic idea of these fascists are vampires, there's not much to it. They reflect on the corruption of the Pinochet regime and how they extracted wealth from the country, but this is all done through reminiscing. There's also a Catholic nun who shows up under, I think, the guise of being an accountant. I was wondering which way they'd go with this, as the Catholic right was an ally of the Chilean regime, but there were other Catholics who resisted it. In the end, it turns out this woman was sent to try to rob the count on behalf of the church because the church needs money. Obviously, this is quite a cynical take on religion, but it doesn't appear to parallel any actual relationship between Catholicism and the reactionary dictatorships of South America. Another confusing aspect of this nun is that at several points she just plainly tells the vampires things you'd think she wouldn't want them to know, and they completely ignore her. Like she says, "It's my plan to turn you against each other so you all die," and they don't react. Obviously that happens in American Psycho, but there's a wider thematic point there about how the super rich can get away with anything, and in this vacuous society no one really cares what you're saying. I don't think that would apply here, and even if it did, that would just be rehashing what that movie already did. The main plot is that Pinochet wants to die by ceasing to eat blood entirely, so his children show up to divide his inheritance before he dies. I'll be honest, I found a lot of the characterization in this film quite difficult to discern. Like, when the characters decide to do things, even by the end of the film, they could have done the exact opposite thing and I wouldn't have thought that was strange, which is a problem. A good example of this is there's this whole thing about the fact that Pinochet supposedly wants to die, but someone's been going out hunting humans. Thing is, we already know that Pinochet's servant is a vampire as well, so I obviously thought almost immediately, well, it's probably just his servant. But then at the end they kind of treat the revelation it was actually his servant as if it was a twist, or at least they seem to. Again, I found it really hard to get an impression of how the movie really wanted us to feel about these characters beyond the obvious vampires and fascists are bad. The most exciting part of the movie is right at the end. There's a narrator who is in some way connected to the Count, and then she shows up towards the end and it turns out it's Margaret Thatcher. The movie said Margaret Thatcher is an evil monster and I clapped. Everyone clapped. I mean, there's not that much to this apart from drawing attention to the known fact that Thatcher was a fan and ally of Pinochet. After this, lots of people die, and that's always exciting. I should also praise this movie for its cinematography, which is the only reason I'm watching it, and that's the category for which it was nominated at the Academy Awards, but I wasn't blown away by it. The only thing I noticed particularly was there were some shots with some pleasing symmetry, and I think often the vampires were shot from a slightly low angle to make them seem more powerful. Still, for me this film could have been better. The premise was great, so I'm just aware of how much more entertaining and visceral and funny and intelligent it could have been starting from this premise. So, middling 6. One thing I'll say to the credit of Nyad is that it avoids doing the worst thing a biopic can do, and of course that is to basically just tell the story of someone's entire life with no clear focus. This movie is very specifically about the attempts of this woman to swim from Cuba to Florida from 2011 to 2013. It obviously involves her reflecting back on moments of her life before then, but the plot has a singular focus, and this is what every biopic should do. And in focusing on this one specific thing, the film is actually able to explore this person's life more deeply and meaningfully because the plot is already accounted for, so the rest of the time can be spent on character and theming. Because this is just one period of her life, she is mostly with the same group of people for the duration of it, and you do get a strong impression of the relationship between the core cast of characters, which carries a lot of the emotional moments of the film. The film also does a good job at communicating Nyad's flaws, that she is incredibly controlling and views other people as simply a means to advance her own goals, and also that she is offended by the idea of being content with mediocrity. The dialogue around that last point is actually a bit on the nose, and makes me think about Mr. Incredible's similar character trait. The core theme here is anxiety around aging and refusing to be constrained by your biological clock. The movie jumps through her first failed attempts quite quickly, and aside from focusing on the preparation, it spends most of its time on the final attempt that was successful. They do embellish the story a bit. She has a near shark encounter, which didn't actually happen, but that's the type of embellishing I'm fine with. You've got to make the movie entertaining somehow, and slightly exaggerating what happened is a good way to do that. What I'm not okay with is that unless I miss something, this movie makes it sound like she's going to be the first person to swim from Cuba to Florida. People keep saying she'll be the first, and apparently some doctors said they thought this wasn't humanly possible. But it turns out that actually, both a man and a woman swam this distance before she did. The only difference is that they used a shark cage, while she just used some electronic signals to keep the sharks away. And apparently that makes it the first unassisted swim, even though she does objectively have plenty of assistance, so I'm not sure where the cutoff is. Either way, they definitely don't make it clear other people have done assisted crossings before, so I kind of felt like this movie lied to me. And then this motivated me to research just a little bit, and it turns out Nyad's crossing being unassisted is heavily disputed, and there are inconsistencies in people's accounts. Obviously the movie doesn't have to be accurate to be good, and it's not like it straight up lies about anything, just withholds some key information that makes this achievement less impressive. There are obviously completely fictional movies about humans doing incredible things. The 2005 movie On a Clear Day is about an old man who decides to swim across the English Channel. It's totally made up, but from my memory it's a really sweet, emotionally satisfying film. In this movie, the only thing they do to really add emotional intensity is flashbacks revealing that her swimming coach abused her when she was a teenager. This adds an extra layer to the film, and it does imply there's some connection between the powerlessness she felt being abused in that vulnerable position and her desire now to push herself to overcome obstacles and refuse to accept defeat. Another layer added to the film artistically is that apparently people hallucinate after not sleeping for 50 hours, and the way they depict those hallucinations is honestly quite beautiful. One thing I should say before I conclude is that this movie very much wants to get you hyped up for this big accomplishment. The issue is, I have an anxiety disorder, which means I tend to respond to that type of energy by becoming incredibly anxious and uncomfortable. Therefore, it's hard for me to review the film, as sometimes I was just focusing on trying to regulate my physical response to the anxiety, and at other times I needed to pause to calm myself down. I don't think that massively affects my opinion of the film, but it did affect my experience. Overall, I would praise this movie for its singular focus on a specific event, and the way the emotions around that event form quite a complete view of this character. However, it's also a pretty simple plot, and it doesn't help knowing it wasn't even constrained by accuracy. So, let's say high 6. Rustin, just like Nyad, avoids falling into the biopic trap. The film is about civil rights leader Bayard Rustin and tells the story of him organising the March on Washington. As such, like any movie about a big project, a lot of focus is put on the ups and downs of the logistical organisation. In particular, Rustin's idea of bringing together all these disparate civil rights organisations is presented as very novel, and the movie spends a lot of time focusing on the backroom politics and internal divisions within the civil rights movement. Obviously, this makes the movie inherently more interesting than a movie that boils it down to black versus white. Showing how all these different black people were fighting each other is not only more interesting, but also more true to the internal divisions that prevent solidarity for marginalized people. By the way, one of the main guys opposing Rustin is played by Chris Rock, and I just find it kind of fun seeing comedians as actors in serious roles. They also focus on the efforts of the establishment to bring these people down, but not so much. There's just a few silent calls Rustin gets suggesting the FBI FBI is trying to intimidate him. The big conclusion to the movie is that despite Rustin's significance to the civil rights movement, and the fact he was the OG of non-violent resistance who introduced MLK to the idea, his legacy is largely ignored. This movie sort of presents itself as being about the more degenerate civil rights movement. Obviously, a big focus around the legacy of Martin Luther King is this idea of respectability politics, that people will say the reason why MLK was so successful is because he wore a nice suit and spoke eloquently. But to be fair, even those fringe, more controversial civil rights groups like those led by Rustin still have people wearing suits and speaking eloquently. Really, it's just a reminder of how stupid racism is. It's insane to see these dapper gents in suits speaking more coherently than either of the last two presidents of the United States, and white people in this movie are still being racist towards them and treating them with suspicion. I just can't imagine how warped your mind has to be that you'll see a black dude all smiles and dressed in his Sunday best and think, yeah, that guy's the problem with society. And of course the funny thing is, King himself wasn't actually uncontroversial. He was killed by the US government after all. They attacked Bayard for being a former member of the Communist Party, but King was pretty closely associated with communism himself, and his later campaign against broader wealth inequality suggested some communist sympathies. Anyway, I should say the real reason Rustin is sidelined isn't because he's a communist, but because he's gay. This mostly just adds a layer of interpersonal drama to things. There's a love triangle going on between him and his friend/lover and this new guy who's come along. It's a perfectly effective bit of tension to add to the story, and it also obviously overlaps with the politics. Rustin doesn't actively campaign for gay rights, but he argues that just as he was born black, he was also born gay. So it's very much about gay rights. We also at one point see a gay bar get raided by the FBI, and Rustin and his black lover express how fortunate they are that they weren't there that night. Of course, it's not just about being gay. Rustin's new lover is actually married with children, and therefore is committing adultery, which is a different matter entirely. This definitely adds moral nuance to the film, which I appreciate. Also, this guy is a preacher, so there's an underlying current of religious hypocrisy at play. With that said, it's kind of weird they don't touch on the fact that MLK himself wasn't even really a Christian. He famously denied a lot of core doctrines like the bodily resurrection of Christ. Politics and religion are both really interesting areas of society, so they could have touched on that more. A final layer to the intersectional politics of this movie is that several women point out that black women are underrepresented in this fight, which obviously is a criticism that many black feminists have made. Overall, I'd say this movie is gratifyingly nuanced in the way it looks at these issues. I guess any Academy Award film relating to race needs to have the question asked, is this a movie made for white people that tries to provide a sense of catharsis around race without actually challenging systemic racial inequality? Obviously, that's the criticism made against films like Driving Miss Daisy and Green Book. I would generally say no. I mean, this movie definitely is overall feel-good in its message, in contrast to something like Judas and the Black Messiah, but I think it's intelligent and honest enough in its portrayal of real history that it's a perfectly good film to watch. Indeed, for bringing attention to a less-known figure of history, telling his unique story, and exploring some generally less explored aspects of the internal divisions within this often oversimplified political movement, I'm going to give this film a high 6. I actually got some ginger tea, so this might improve things. Next, I watched Society of the Snow, or La Soledad de Nieve. Maybe. I didn't look up the original title, I'm just going off my own knowledge of Spanish. Thanks, Duolingo. That was really worth the hundreds of hours I spent on you. Obviously, this movie is as depressing and horrifying as you'd imagine from the premise. That premise being a recount of the true story of some survivors of a plane crash who were stranded on a mountain and resorted to cannibalism to stay alive. You can kind of split this movie into three basic aspects. The first is the immediate physical challenges of their situation. When the plane crash is happening, you see all these quick flashes of deaths and injuries, and it's all a bit overwhelming. And then obviously many people are injured, and there's a fundamental time limit on their ability to survive. As people die, we see a little note come up with their name and age. Towards the beginning, there are dozens of names on the screen as it's counting all the casualties off. One danger immediately communicated is the threat of the cold, and in the first night we see people freezing to death. Now, not to victim blame here, but this was a bit confusing. The luggage is nearby to them, and presumably everyone packed multiple layers of clothing. I don't fly anywhere unless it's for at least a few days, so I'll have plenty of changes of clothes, and obviously there are people who are dead who won't need their clothes, so they must have like at least 6 complete outfits per person. You'd think that's enough for them to wrap themselves up pretty warm, but for some reason they all just try to make it through the night in the same clothes they were wearing from earlier that day. Also, I almost immediately thought, couldn't they just start traveling in a direction? I was thinking this right away, and then I thought I'd look it up, and it turns out that the nearest town was only 25 miles away. So obviously mountains would present a challenge in terms of how fast they can move, but even traveling at a mile a day would get you somewhere pretty fast, and the downhill bits you could probably travel much faster. By the way, there's a stream only 9 miles away, so once you hit that, you just follow it downhill and you're fine. I feel they could have communicated why this isn't possible better, especially since eventually after I guess 60 days or so, they do decide to just head west, and actually it doesn't seem like it was that much of a challenge for them. The big change that causes them to depart is that they find some waterproof material and are like, now we can make waterproof sleeping bags. Was that all they needed? This isn't me genuinely pointing out a plot hole in this movie based on real events, it's just the movie makes it impossible not to think. You're shown the crash site and all the mountains around them look big but not insurmountable. Like when they do eventually decide to move, the guy walking says, the Andes have to come to an end eventually, which is what I'd think too. Anyway, of course with this film, the main impediment to their survival isn't a physical issue so much as it's a moral aversion. The moral aversion to cannibalizing dead people. The movie does a very good job at making you feel the weight of this decision, the resistance that someone would feel towards it. I don't want to understate this point. The fact this actually happened is insane, and the emotional and thematic weight of it is tremendous. The film actually starts off with them at church, listening to the story of Jesus being tempted in the desert without food or water for 40 days, and the parallels to what these characters go through can't be missed. The timing does end up feeling a bit weird because of this though. They draw attention to the fact you can only survive 3 weeks without food. So then they ration the food they have, and then they start trying to eat the leather of the plane seats. Then obviously once they're all starving, someone suggests eating the people, and they eventually start doing it after a huge amount of resistance. Some time goes by, and they seem to be trying to get used to living life as normal. They're even playing some little word games together to build camaraderie, and then it flashes up, and it's October 30th. It's only been 17 days. In some sense it makes sense to draw out the decision to resort to cannibalism, but the level of desperation they show them sinking to makes it feel like it's been longer than just over 2 weeks. I mean, 2 weeks is a long time, but they explicitly said humans can survive 3 weeks without any food. But what's even more weird is that they don't get rescued until December 23rd, and that time is comparatively rushed through. It's also weird to me that they make their big trek around the winter solstice when it would... Okay, I just realized in the middle of writing this that this is set in the southern hemisphere, which kind of changes my entire perception of this film. I guess this movie actually takes place in the middle of summer, so that confuses me because there's a moment where they get the radio working and it just so happens to immediately be delivering information about the search effort, which is a bit of a nitpick, but still. Anyway, they say that they'll resume the search after the thaw, but it's spring. When exactly are they waiting for? Anyway, I've ended up talking about this movie for a while, so let me just say I liked watching them do proactive plans in the mountains, because that's obviously more entertaining. It was also a very clever decision to have the main character die, so that you realise any of these people could have died. And with that said, the final part of this movie is the survivor's guilt. I mean, I've heard about survivor's guilt, but this must be next level. Not only knowing you lived while others died, but that you lived because you ate the flesh of those who died. It's a completely understandable action, and I'm sure I'd do the same, but I also am sure that I couldn't help but to feel shame once back in regular society. The big rescue moment brings with it no sense of triumph, not when one of the considerations is where are they going to hide the skeletons of the people they've eaten. And all I could think when looking at the bodies of these survivors, malnourished and injured, is how long is it going to take them to recover, not just physically but mentally. And honestly, this movie could have had a whole other movie on top of it exploring that survivor's guilt, because it sort of just has to address it through an epilogue taking the form of a voiceover. It's only the final 10 minutes of the film. The movie is definitely good, very unpleasant to watch, but in a way that really sticks with you. My only real criticism is that it left me confused about how some of this went down specifically, but obviously you can understand that for these real people this was a horrible experience, and it's easy to get roped into that experience. But I don't think the movie did that much artistically to really elevate the impact of that experience on the viewer. For me, this is going to be a middling 7 out of 10. I've twice now mentioned the qualities of a good biopic. Napoleon is a perfect example of a bad biopic. It is everything a biopic should not be. just a passionless, methodical recounting of the key moments of someone's life with no overarching narrative or insight or any particular focus. It starts off in 1793 by showing Napoleon win a significant battle, then immediately jumps to the 1794 overthrow of Robespierre, then in 1795 it shows us a royalist insurrection, before jumping to 1798 and Napoleon's invasion of Egypt, which is given a handful of scenes before he returns. The first issue here is it makes the narrative feel disjointed, when loads of random events just happen sequentially despite being separated by months of key events. The whole thing just feels like a Wikipedia summary. Also, it doesn't make it especially clear why this stuff is happening or the wider context. This is showing the Napoleonic Wars, but you barely get any impression of France's position relative to Britain or any of their allies. At some point someone mentions that the French territories in Italy and the Netherlands are under threat, and we were never given any indication France had those holdings in the first place. All we've seen is the French successfully defend their own land and unsuccessfully invade Egypt, and the internal politics, which should really have more focus, is completely inscrutable. Napoleon just went from a random general to being a very powerful general to in 1799 taking over as one of the 3 consuls, and then in 1804 being coronated as king. We have no idea how any of that went down. As a result, this movie is the definition of vapid. It says a whole load of stuff without actually saying anything at all. Anything else could be happening on screen right now and it would make no difference to the movie, because what's happening on screen really doesn't matter. It's just a load of random events from his life. Aside from that, the movie then just focuses on the remaining big 3 military moments of Napoleon's life: Austerlitz, the invasion of Russia, and Waterloo. The ending is more entertaining. I like how goated it is that he just asks his men to join him and they all agree. Also, Waterloo actually had a sense of finality to it, which makes it feel like it had a point. Even then though, the movie still shows his exile to St. Helena, and the last shot is him collapsing and dying. This movie just couldn't leave anything out. It's a miracle they didn't show us his birth, and that makes for a bad movie. I'd argue the principal talent in making a biopic is picking out what aspects of someone's life are most significant and then contriving that into a complete story with a clear focus that gives an impression of who that person is. By that standard, this movie is devoid of talent. If this was a movie about Napoleon's campaign in Egypt, which then transitioned to being about the fall of the First Republic and ended with him being coronated emperor, then it would be a good movie. If it was a movie about Napoleon's relationship to Russia and that slow deterioration ended with his disastrous invasion, it would be a good movie. But a movie that tries to blast through the entire life of someone whose life could encompass several good movies will end up being a bad movie inevitably. I will say the one attempt this movie has at a story is in his marriage to Josephine. He starts courting her quite early on, and a lot of attention is paid to him trying to have an heir, and she dies towards the end. However, in my view, this isn't as much of a focus as to justify saying the movie has a coherent plot because it's centered on her. I mean, you just heard me recount all the biographic highlights of Napoleon's life that this movie hits up, and most of that stuff doesn't relate to Josephine at all, except for him leaving Egypt because his wife was cheating on him, which isn't actually historically accurate and kind of makes Napoleon seem really incompetent. Generally speaking, I don't mind the historical inaccuracy in this film. Even him firing at the pyramids doesn't bother me, even if it is stupid. The whole frozen lake thing in Austerlitz is apparently heavily embellished, but I'm fine for a movie to embellish things. I would rather a movie was slightly inaccurate in order to contrive a complete and satisfying story, and be entirely accurate and as such with no structured narrative at all. As it happens, this movie has inaccuracies, but not in service of creating much of a narrative. This movie offends me. It offends me because it's such a refusal to actually engage with the art of filmmaking. Anyone could do this. Anyone could write a script that consists of just skimming a Wikipedia article and saying, oh, we could throw that in there. The only thing I'll credit this film with is that all the technical aspects are on point. I just wish it was in service of something. For the technical aspects alone, I'll generously give this film a middling 3. So the thing about The Colour Purple is that it's a remake, and I personally review films by how much of a point they have, meaning if a film's a remake, the first question I'm thinking is, does this improve on the original film, or is it in fact worse? This is one reason why, going forward, I will probably, whenever I review a remake, also review the original film, because my opinion on the original will massively impact my opinion on the remake. Unfortunately, I decided like a chump to watch the original when I first watched this film a year or so ago, and I do distinctly remember thinking, this film is pretty pointless when viewed relative to the original, but I don't really remember the original film now well enough to say specifically why. My memory is that the first film was slightly more gritty, and was also better paced. With this film, I think maybe because it's a remake, they actually blast through a lot of the key plot points. Especially at the beginning, you don't really feel the impact of the abusive home Celie grew up in as much as you do for the original. Which is bad, because I remember not loving the original because I wasn't that emotionally invested in a relationship between the sisters, and here I was even less so, because we see less of them together. Probably the biggest difference between the two films is this is 100% a musical. Early on, the musical numbers are very frequent, and I don't think they especially drop off. The issue is not many of these songs are that great. I do like the gospel music style a lot of them have, but there were few songs that really stand out. And the main song that stands out is actually just a song from the original film. Aside from that, there's also a song which is, I guess, called Hell No, and I liked that one. It reminds me a lot of the Think song from Blues Brothers. For me, the real test of a musical is, would I independently search up these songs and jam to them the same way I would to any other piece of music? I know that West Side Story is a good musical because I own and regularly listen to the entire soundtrack from beginning to end. I can't imagine myself looking up any of these songs just for the joy of listening to them, never mind working my way through the whole album. Oh, also, one moment sounded noticeably auto-tuned. I'll say now, for my benefit later on when I edit this, that it's about 22 minutes and 50 seconds into the film. If this film has a single theme, it would be about female solidarity and cycles of male abuse. I mean, Celie's stepfather sexually abused her, and then because of that she was submissive to her husband Albert, or Mr. as he prefers to be called, but then he in turn has a dad who's constantly denigrating and attacking him. Also, at one point Celie tells her own son Harpo to beat his wife, so there's clearly a lot going on there. Then, in radical contrast, there are moments where the women come together eventually and have each other's backs. At some points there's even some pretty strong suggestions of lesbian attraction. Overall though, I'm not sure if this film exactly says anything about these themes. It mostly just uses them to establish the varied cast of characters, which is certainly worthwhile, and I do get a strong sense of the individual character traits of everyone. I should say there's also a "we were kings" thing going on. Like, someone literally says that Africans were kings in their own land, which, I've got to be honest, always seemed kind of dumb to me. Like, obviously there were kings in Africa, there still are kings in Africa, but it just makes me imagine a film about poor white people in West Virginia or something being told, you know, back in Europe, we were great kings. And presumably they'd be like, what the hell kind of bearing does that have on our current situation though? Like, maybe it's just because I live in a literal monarchy, and I'm within like an hour's drive of a literal king, and I myself am not a monarchist and would rather we abolish the title of king. It just makes the king thing ring kind of hollow. Anyway, the final big theme, indeed the titular theme, is that you need to stop and appreciate the beauty of God's world. Celie's friend, Shug, says that we need to appreciate God's creation, and you should never walk past the color purple without stopping to appreciate its beauty. Thing is, that's a weak point for the film in a way. The very title of the film suggests this is something we should be focusing on, but this film just isn't about stopping to appreciate the beauty of the world. If it's about anything, it's about recognizing God exists in the kind actions of others. For example, Celie's abusive husband, from whom she eventually separates, goes on to be tormented by apparently divine forces for his past actions, until he eventually, at considerable personal cost, endeavors to bring Celie's sister Nettie back to see her. The film is quite emotionally intense. A scene I had forgotten but suddenly remembered is where Sophia is arrested for refusing to be a maid to a white woman, which is obviously a very sad reminder of the injustice these people faced. Having said that, some of the emotional developments felt kind of arbitrary, like how out of nowhere Celie ends up inheriting a shop and running that for the rest of the film. Overall, there are positives of this film to be appreciated, but it does annoy me that it doesn't appear to have anything particularly worthwhile to say about the very theme that's alluded to in the title. And a further weakness is that this is a remake that just doesn't add anything. I would say there's no point watching this film when you can just watch the original, so I guess I'll give this a high 5. It's not bad, but it's definitely pointless. The film Golda is really very similar to Zone of Interest, except it goes even further. Obviously, Zone of Interest is about an ethno-state regime engaged in the ethnic cleansing of the land they want to occupy, and we follow the story of a family committed to carrying out that operation while the genocide fades into the background. In this movie, we see a war where we entirely follow it from the perspective of the evil side. This is such a novel idea, and I do kind of admire it. Even Zone of Interest didn't follow the war itself from the perspective of the bad guys, but this film does. Much like Zone of Interest, Interest, this film focuses on people talking about the logistics of how they're going to carry out this operation. There's a framing device for this story where Golda is being questioned as to whether she adequately defended the occupation. There are some other interesting parallels. Golda at one point says that she doesn't want to be taken alive if the liberating forces end up taking the capital city. It's impossible not to hear this and immediately think of Berlin in 1945. Clearly, this was a deliberate parallel drawn between two leaders of evil regimes who were both too cowardly to actually consider answering for their crimes, and thus were committed to suicide before allowing themselves to be captured with the fall of their regime. Another genius artistic decision from this film is to show that Golda has cancer, and yet she continues to smoke despite knowing she has cancer. Clearly, this is an analogy to evil in general. Cancer is like the evil that is manifest in this regime, and the continued addiction to smoking represents the refusal of the people there to relent of the evil they're doing. Another fantastic way this movie shows this is in how obviously entitled this regime is shown to be. At one point, Golda is on the phone to the US and says how grateful they should be that they didn't launch a preemptive strike, as that would have made the US look bad. But obviously the regime didn't do that out of kindness or concern for the US or their people. They did that because they want US money and US weapons. You don't get to rely on another nation for support and then say that other nation should be grateful when you do what they want. You should be grateful to them for assisting your occupation. We're also shown that this regime spies on their allies, as early on we see some Secret Service agents clearly operating out of Britain and presumably as such spying on the British population, even though these people are supposed to be allies. This movie is really clever and subtle in the way that they communicate the insincerity of this regime and the way that they lie. At one point, Golda is asked how many soldiers died in an attack, and she replies by giving approximate figures clearly rounded to the nearest 100, but she then says, "I counted every single one of them." Obviously this is a lie, because if you counted every single one of them, you wouldn't be giving approximate figures. This is so obvious that clearly we as the audience are supposed to understand that shows this woman is an evil, insincere liar. So this means that when she says that the Arab leaders don't actually care about the men fighting for them, we can infer this is probably just a lie designed to make her seem like more of a humanitarian. And this is confirmed when she then says that she would be willing to wipe out 30,000 men who are encircled, and her condition for not doing this is that her regime be recognized as a legitimate state. So she's willing to kill 30,000 men just so that someone will admit the occupation is legitimate. It's not even about saving lives, just about forcing other people to bend their words to your will. But of course we also know that this isn't about saving lives, because we know that this entire regime exists from river to sea on the land of another nation. We know that Golda comes from Ukraine. She admits as much. Well, if you're serious about peace, you don't invade someone else's country. At one point, a general says of the people resisting the occupation, "We will crush their bones. We will tear them limb from limb." This sounds like the dialogue of an evil monster in a fantastical story, and it shows that there is a dehumanization inherent in being an active part of maintaining a regime like this. This makes the juxtaposition powerful when the movie introduces relatable concerns from these people, like there's a typist in the government whose son dies in defending the occupation, just like in Zone of Interest, where we're made to relate to the concerns and priorities of the oppressors, so it is here. And just like that very same regime, we have war propaganda of smiling soldiers as if they're not aware of what they're carrying out. In Zone of Interest, we don't see the real victims of this regime, but we simply hear what's happening to them. What makes this film more powerful and more grotesque is that we know that the people whose land is currently being occupied during this movie exist, but we don't actually see them at all. Their presence isn't acknowledged. I think as a companion to the Zone of Interest, this is a really interesting movie to watch, just so you can take in all the parallels. Anyway, unfortunately, since this movie is very similar to Zone of Interest in terms of overall message and of course the focus of the plot being about the modern equivalent to the very regime depicted in the Zone of Interest, I'm going to have to deduct some points for lacking originality and give this a low 1. Everyone loves a good escapist fantasy, and Flamin Hot is very much an escapist fantasy. So for those who don't know, this story is about a Mexican immigrant who grew up poor and ended up falling into a life of crime, but eventually secured a legitimate job as a janitor at a Frito-Lay factory. Once there, he actively commits himself to learning as much about the business as possible, and eventually comes up with the idea of Flamin Hot Cheetos as a way to appeal to and capture the Latino market. So like I say, this sounds like an escapist fantasy, right? It's the myth that we live in a meritocracy where as long as you're ambitious and you work hard, you will succeed. Interestingly, that aspect of the story is apparently true. This guy was a criminal who started working as a janitor and ended up becoming a marketing executive. The big exaggeration in that regard is that he actually became a machine operator way before he became a marketing executive. This film, for more dramatic effect, has him go straight from the janitor with a bold new idea to then being promoted straight to a marketing executive. This film definitely leans into that grit. He's all like, hey, I'm not some big corporate guy, but I know about real people. It's a very populist narrative. They also suggest that his life as a drug dealer gave him a knack for sales, and they do that thing from Ant-Man where a Mexican guy relays a conversation featuring a bunch of white people, but while they're acting out saying stuff, it's with the voice of a Mexican, so it comedically juxtaposes this corporate world with a very atypical way of speaking for that environment. Unsurprisingly, the movie focuses on anti-Mexican discrimination and tries to present a message of empowerment for that community. I imagine this is probably accurate to his life and adds an extra level of aspiration to the whole story, but that's the thing. This movie is all about adding that extra level of aspiration. This movie was clearly made to make people feel hopeful about our system, and that's why they're really trying to tug on your heartstrings. He's got a dad who was abusive and at the end of the film they reconcile. He's got a wife who sticks by him and has his back. They frequently reference the providence of God and the importance of having faith. The obvious criticism would be that this is lying, it's propaganda, and it doesn't reflect the fact that there are millions of people from economically disadvantaged backgrounds who work really hard and have the drive to succeed, and nothing like this happens for them. I mean, this rags to riches story is seemingly more authentic than most, no small loan of $1 million here, but of course this happens sometimes. It's in the interests of corporations to occasionally elevate really talented, hard-working people because it makes sense for stories like this that motivate others to believe the system actually is working and does reward the right people. On that note, there's an interesting controversy I have to mention. See, I'm saying the broad strokes of this movie are accurate because I'd say the main point of this movie is that a guy from a poor background rises to the level of executive. However, the titular focus of this movie is actually apparently not true. You can look into it, but there's lots of inconsistencies in the story that this guy invented Flamin Hot Cheetos, which I was already suspicious about. These companies have scientists who spend months in controlled conditions perfecting the perfect flavor, and what we see in this film is Montañez and his family just throwing together ingredients from a Mexican supermarket and making the product. And when they make it, it's literally bright red like the real thing, as if you can achieve that with natural ingredients. Side note, a big focus here is put on the fact that Flamin' Hot Cheetos are so spicy that they hurt to eat. The phrase that inspires their creation in the movie is, "It burns good." But Flamin' Hot Cheetos really aren't that spicy. Some more evidence of inconsistency is that they present it as if Richard Montañez invented the idea of appealing to the Latino market, but at the same time the movie also admits that Frito-Lay were already working on their own spicy version of the product. So I can't really buy this idea that Richard Montañez was seen as some revolutionary for coming up with an idea that they were already working on. And indeed, it seems like it was actually these people already working on the product who invented it, not Richard Montañez. This was all discovered by some investigative journalists, and what's not at all surprising is that Frito-Lay themselves have no interest in disputing Montañez's claims, because there's now a movie that portrays their company as a land of opportunity where a hard-working man can succeed and make a great product that comes from an authentic Mexican immigrant. You can't buy that publicity, although maybe they did actually fund this movie in some way. Either way, it's obviously not in their interest for the account presented in this movie to be contradicted, which is why they've resisted contradicting that account. But unfortunately, if the account is wildly inconsistent with known information, then you can't stop journalists uncovering that. Anyway, this movie is definitely emotionally manipulative and kind of propagandistic. It has a very idealized worldview that obviously fails to say anything particularly interesting about society. However, I will say at least it's pretty good at being emotionally manipulative. If I had to pick a crowd-pleasing, feel-good, reasonably entertaining movie, I wouldn't have a problem with this one. But like most such movies, it's kind of cliche, and there are aspects of this that feel especially artificial, so you'll be rolling your eyes a lot more than you would for an actually good movie. From me, it will have to be a low 4. And now, finally, we reach the big conclusion. The Best Picture winner, Oppenheimer. I must admit, the first time I watched this, I found it overly long and as such kind of boring, so I resolved to return back to it when I would feel more able to digest and enjoy a 3-hour film. And of course, what better time than after watching dozens of films, over the course of just a few weeks for the purpose of this review. Well, surprisingly, I actually found the runtime of this film to be less grating than I first did a year ago. I was able to enjoy each scene and make it from the beginning to the end without being bored. Having said that, I'm not sure if this film justifies being as long as it is, and the runtime is a reason why I can't imagine myself watching this film ever again. And I'm going to talk about this film by breaking it down into some key constituent parts: the personal life and early career of Oppenheimer, his actual time spent constructing the bombs, the accusations that he has communist affiliations, his relationship with Strauss, and the broad existential horror of entering the nuclear age. If I'm saying the film's runtime is still an issue to me, I'll say now that I really think a lot of Oppenheimer's personal life could have been cut, as indeed could his early education. I mean, you already know he's a great physicist, you wouldn't lose much by jumping more immediately into the Manhattan Project. Also, some of this stuff feels like it was motivated by the thought, that's really interesting, we should put that in there. Like his relationship with Jean Tatlock. He has this underdeveloped relationship with a woman who is just characterized as kind of annoying, like she rejects a relationship with him but seems mad when he gets with someone else. Don't really have any sympathy for that. And then she takes her own life because she's a crazy, unstable, self-destructive person. I don't really think that plot point adds anything worthwhile to the film, but obviously if Oppenheimer's lover killed herself, I guess you have to add it to the movie because that's a really significant thing. Same for the apple poisoning scene. This just feels completely random, as if it was just put in because wow, Oppenheimer tried to poison one of his teachers? That's such a crazy fact about him, we should make sure to put that in. But it turns out, this isn't even true. Like, it's a completely random, pointless addition, and it's not even accurate. So yeah, I think this movie would be better if these details from his personal life weren't included. Obviously, the thing that must be included is his time spent working on the atomic bomb, although I'm sure this could have been cut down. The big moment is, of course, when they actually do the first test. This does a fantastic job at making you feel the magnitude of what they're achieving with this product. I really do enjoy that. Now would also be a time to say I do enjoy the random flashes of abstract physicsy images inserted into the film to show Oppenheimer considering big ideas. Just very artistic. Honestly though, I couldn't say that any aspect of him building the bomb is fantastic. Like, it is just the same as I would expect any film about some scientist working on a big project to be. I guess next is the whole communism thing, which is of course connected to his early life, but frankly Oppenheimer just comes across as a very non-committal person with a lot of his beliefs, so it's not as if he's actually a communist. Really, this is all just part of the effort of Strauss to bring him down, and this is where the movie gets really interesting. Because when you watch it again, it's almost bizarre. In many ways, the focal point of this film is this beef that a guy called Strauss has with Oppenheimer, and Strauss's efforts to bring him down in a manner that comes across as obsessive. And all of this is because Oppenheimer made an offhand joke about one of Strauss's ideas being stupid, and also one time Oppenheimer said something to someone and Strauss thought it might have been about him because they were kind of cold to him after. Now obviously, this is ridiculous. It's ridiculous that in a movie about a bomb that killed hundreds of thousands of people, a large part of the focus is on the petty grievance of this random politician. But I don't necessarily mean for that to be taken as a criticism, because it genuinely is quite interesting. It almost kind of reminds me of a movie like Burn After Reading, where all this crazy stuff is happening and it seems important to people, but in reality it's just a bunch of incompetent people making mistakes. It's a very subversive and unconventional way to tell a story, and that's what this Strauss subplot felt like. He's basically just a raging narcissist, and that is an interesting trait for a character to have. The huge gaping issue is, it feels kind of disconnected from the rest of the film. Like, yeah, having a story about a guy who's obsessed with taking someone down for hilariously petty reasons is an interesting choice in a movie committed to absurdism, but this movie is otherwise very serious. I actually think it might have been best if this movie focused almost entirely on the aftermath of the Manhattan Project, because there is an incredible line in this movie. You probably already know what it is. Early on, they theorized that maybe if they split the atom and then that atom in exploding hits other atoms and splits them, and then they're not able to control the exponential growth, and suddenly they end up doing nuclear fission with the entire atmosphere. And then, at the end, Oppenheimer says to Einstein, "Do you remember when we were worried we'd start a chain reaction that would destroy the world? I think we did." And obviously he's talking about a political chain reaction as the nuclear arms race kicks off. Honestly, I wish this film had focused on the nuclear arms race a bit more, because it's actually not the main focus of the latter half of the film. I prefer this film if it started with Hitler's death, and then quickly caught us up on the current state of the project, and then focused much more on the political aftermath of the bombings. Because all Oppenheimer's concern about the bombs is interesting, but you don't really see it because they focused on loads of other stuff instead. I've spent more time talking about this film, but it's very long, wrong, and it did win Best Picture, so I'll afford myself one important closing point. I don't really get the whole moralizing about using the bomb on Japan, because as someone points out in this very film, the firebombing of Tokyo killed way more people, so what even is the unique moral concern here? Like, is this way of burning people to death so much worse than all the other ways? At least for some people an atomic bomb is instantaneous, so less painful. For me, what's interesting about the bomb is the wider existential dread that comes from weapons of mass destruction, which the film pays some attention to, but I'd rather it were a bigger focus. So with all that said, I don't know, low 7. There's still plenty of stuff to appreciate in the film, which I can now better recognise, but a second watch has also confirmed I'd never want to watch this movie again, and a lack of rewatchability makes it very hard for me to justify giving a film a rating into the high 7s and 8 range. Also, I'm crediting the film with how bizarre the Strauss subplot is, but arguably you could be just as justified in considering it a criticism that a large part of the drama of this film hinges on one guy's ridiculous petty grievances. Anyway everyone, that's the end of the video, thanks for watching, tune in next week where I'll be reviewing every film nominated for an Oscar in the first Academy Awards. Click the video on the screen now and check the description for part 1.